Louisiana Legends is made possible by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Louisiana. This important program series enables us to discover, through the accomplishments of our fellow Louisianians, the unique character of a state so proudly served by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Louisiana for 60 years.
Quite simply, Cokie Roberts is all over the place. ABC television, This Week with David Brinkley. She's been on National Public Radio, McNeil-Lehrer, on public television, and she's the winner of an Emmy. But her great accomplishment in Louisiana is she's Lindy Boggs' daughter. Cokie, thank you for joining us.
I'm so glad to be here, Gus.
You were born in Louisiana?
I was at Touro Infirmary in New Orleans. Daddy at that point was in the Navy. It was during World War II. And he had been elected to Congress in 1940 and then defeated in 1942 and came back, and the war was on, of course, and so he went into the Navy. He always joked that he went from being the youngest member of Congress to the oldest ensign in the Navy. And we were here, although he was about to be assigned someplace else, and it ended up that he was assigned to Washington. So we then went to Washington for the war years as well. And then he came back and was reelected in 1946.
And became Speaker of the House.
Became Majority Leader of the House.
Majority Leader, rather, of the House
Yes.
Representatives. Cokie, what was it like those early years in Louisiana?
Well, it was politics, but it was, of course, wonderful, fun Louisiana politics, as interesting as that always is and still is. We went to school half year here and half year in Washington. My sister Barbara and I were lucky because we could go to Sacred Heart schools each place. But even so, we used to joke that just as the nuns would catch on to us, we were in the other city, so it was not a bad deal. And then when years later, when Mom and Daddy decided it was getting a little rough on our education to switch schools at the half year, we went to school year round there and then spent all summers and Christmas and all that time here.
Was Washington, when you finally moved there, was that much of a shock to a couple of Southern gals?
But we had never not been there. Barbara was 15 months old when Daddy was elected, and Tommy was born 10 days after that election, or 8 days after that election. And so we had always spent part of our time there and part of our time here. So we were always bifurcated children.
Your parents were so very active in the life of the nation as well as the life of the family. Did that take much from the familial?
No, my parents, because they were so young when they started this life, and as I just said, that Barbara and Tommy were born. Barbara was an infant during that first campaign for Congress. Tommy was born immediately afterwards. They understood that if there was going to be family life, that political life and family life could not be separated. And so we were included in everything. We were included in all the campaigns and all the parades and all of the speeches and all of the rallies, and we were included in the debates in Congress. I mean, we didn't go on the floor and debate, although we would have loved to have. We would stay out of school and go watch an important debate. We were included in the dinner table conversations with important Americans.
Who was the first president you met?
Well, probably Harry Truman, although I don't remember meeting Harry Truman. I remember meeting Dwight Eisenhower, but I'm not sure whether I ever met Truman or not. Isn't that terrible?
Did any of those presidents ever come to dinner?
Oh, sure.
Kennedy, probably.
Kennedy and of course, Jerry Ford, and Hubert Humphrey wasn't president. Let's see, Lyndon Johnson, sure.
In your adult lifetime, who's been our greatest president?
Oh, I never do. Worst, best. I'm much too smart a reporter for that, Gus.
Which president did you like personally the most?
Well, I don't want to set myself up as someone who was well acquainted with these presidents. I was a child for most of them. Certainly, I was starry-eyed about Jack Kennedy, like so many people were. His presidency coincided with my years in college. He was elected my freshman year and killed my senior year. So that was a very romantic time. I knew Lyndon Johnson certainly better than that, and he was a delightful person to people my age. You know, he was never fighting with us, so that was a pleasure. And of course, getting to know Mrs. Johnson remains one of the great joys of my life. And Jerry Ford was a good family friend, and the Ford kids and I were not the same. I'm older than they are, but we have become friends over a few causes that we've been involved in.
How did you find out about your father's untimely death?
Well, that's a very sad story because I was living in California at the time. I was a young woman. I was in my late 20s, and I had 2 little children. And my husband was the New York Times bureau chief in Los Angeles. And because I was on the West Coast, I think my mother thought that I would not hear the news as quickly as people on the East Coast. I think East Coasters always have this sense that it takes 3 hours to get to the West Coast. And she was contacting my brother and sister and others. And so my husband had seen the news on the wires, on the AP wire, and so he was rushing home to tell me personally when a friend called and said, Cokie, if there's anything we can do to help. And I said, help with what? And this poor person was then left having to tell me, which was really too bad. Yeah.
Your mother has told us the story. She was at home alone.
Right. She was at home alone.
And the phone began ringing.
Well, and it was Carl Albert in her case.
Who was Speaker.
Who was Speaker. Right.
Cokie, how'd you get into journalism?
Well, it's one of those terribly unsatisfying stories for young people who always want to know how to do it. First of all, it was the dark ages. You know, I got out of college in 1964 when women were not really expected to do much of anything. And my first job was with a small television production company in Washington. The owner-runner of that company, Sophie Altman, had gone to Wellesley and hired Wellesley girls. And that production company put a show on the air while I was working there that was a sort of reverse Meet the Press. It was U.S. public figures talking to foreign journalists about what was happening in their countries. And I was the anchor. I was 21 years old. And it was on the NBC station in Washington. Then I got married, moved to New York, quit my job, didn't occur to me not to, and started looking for jobs in New York and ended up married to a journalist, as I say. It was pretty much easier to switch than fight, so I just started doing journalism.
I want to ask you something that we wonder about in the hinterlands. We're told that Washington, the atmosphere, the milieu, the ambience, the political life, is terribly destructive to the humanity and psychic of people who live there and participate particularly in the political process. Now, as a journalist and as somebody, a real Washington insider, and that's meant in the most complimentary way, what's your take on that?
Well, I don't think that needs to be the case, and for many people it's never been the case, and it certainly shouldn't be the case. People who take public service as that, as my parents always did, it is a wonderful privilege and honor to be in Washington and able to serve the people of the 2nd District of Louisiana or wherever you are from. And you know, I've been really struck by it recently. I've been to 2 funerals recently, Ed Muskie's and Ron Brown's. And at the time of someone's death, everyone praises their years in public service and the wonderful things they've done by serving the public and making the personal sacrifice to do that. And yet, while they're in office, everyone is castigating them as mere politicians or dirty politicians or crooked politicians or something with some pejorative before the word politician. And I really do think that that is something we desperately have to work on changing in this country. If we are not going to believe in the institutions of government and the people who serve in them, then we really don't have anything holding us together as a country. I mean, we don't have any common history, ethnicity, religion, language even, so that our Constitution and the institutions it created are our glue. And I'm not saying that we should not question politicians carefully and we should not hold them to a very high standard. All of that's very important. Otherwise, they'll demean the institutions. But I do think that it's a sad state where we think that anything that happens in Washington is some way tainted and evil, because that's just wrong.
Yet it is your very profession, journalism, which quite often...
I couldn't agree more.
...is the force that points that finger. Do you think that perhaps the field of journalism has to kind of take a look at itself? And
sure, and I think it does. I mean, I think there's an awful lot of self-examination, sometimes too much self-examination. Instead of sitting around and having conferences on these subjects and writing books, just go out and do it. But that's sort of my view of life about anything.
Cokie, we've only a few days ago lost Ron Brown, the Secretary of Commerce, in an air crash, young children, and that must have been doubly painful for you, not only as somebody who knew him, but who experienced the very same thing.
It was, and it was particularly hard on my brother, who was a law partner of Ron's and a very close friend. And Michael Brown was 31, is the same age Tommy was when Daddy's plane went down. And Tracy Brown lives in Los Angeles and had to fly in from Los Angeles, as I did. Michael's twin children are 2. And my daughter was the youngest of my father's grandchildren, and she was 2. And the really hard thing, of course, is that she doesn't remember him. And seeing Ron's picture with those darling babies and realizing that they won't remember him.
He was a special man, wasn't he? I mean,
he really was. And I think that Washington was surprised. I know we in the journalistic trade were surprised at how incredible the outpouring for him was after his death. And I think, interestingly enough, that some of it came after he died, that people who really had never heard of him learned about him after he died and then wanted to pay homage to him. So they were lined up at the National Cathedral at 6 o'clock in the morning and lined up to go to the Department of Commerce. It was really quite something.
Cokie, and this is a very general question. You've known presidents and you've covered presidents professionally. What if you had to design a president of the United States, somebody sat you down and said, now you're going to design us a president, what qualities are necessary and what must be a murderous job?
Well, I actually think the American people sort this out pretty well. What we know from years of polling on this is that what people are looking for in a president is a sense of leadership and a sense of character, which is why those issues keep coming up. We want somebody who is going to make the right decision by our own personal lights, no matter what event occurs in the 4 years of his duration as president. I'd love to say his or hers, but so far there's no need. But and that is why I think that all the questions about presidential character are fair to ask, because we want to know as much about a president as we can, so that we can say, okay, well, maybe that's a guy who will in his being know the right thing to do if some disaster comes along. And I think that is the way we sort it out, that we vote on issues for other offices, but that at the presidential level, that is how we tend to select our presidents. And interesting, one of the things I think some candidates don't understand is that there are issues that the public doesn't care about at the moment, but which do give some sense of character in the long run. And the main thing I'm thinking of here is foreign policy. If, in fact, a president pays no attention to foreign policy, even though it's not at the top of everyone's agenda, and lets it drift, and there's a sense that there is no direction and leadership there, that plays into the public perception of the president as not a strong leader, and that's very dangerous for him. In Bill Clinton's case, I think that he started off not understanding that and has come to understand it in the course of his presidency.
Do we want our president to be better than us?
Oh, sure we do. And it's always...
He can't have our foibles, can he?
No, not only can he not have our foibles, he can't wear our clothes. He can't be Mr. Ordinary Guy. We're actually very ambivalent about this. We don't want him to be above us either. And we kind of like it when he carries his own suitcase and that kind of thing. But on the other hand, he has to be very careful not to be too ordinary. Jimmy Carter made the mistake of getting rid of Hale to the chief and all that. Big mistake. I mean, the president needs all the help he can get, and Hale to the chief helps. Bill Clinton shouldn't have worn jogging shorts, you know, and he learned that lesson. I mean, some of this is hard to figure out, particularly if you've had a campaign where you've run against someone like George Bush as being out of touch. You want to be so in touch that that you can harm yourself as a president.
Give us a take on the forthcoming presidential campaign. What do you see ahead? What's going to happen?
What's going to happen?
Not asking for a prediction, just a kind of a feel for it.
Well, I think that that at the moment, and really we are only talking at the moment, we're talking in April of 1996, and between April of 1992 and November of 1992, a lot of things changed, and I think that the same thing is likely to happen this year. But right now, it looks like a couple of things have happened. One is that Bill Clinton has found his voice as a leader, and I think that he is, at the moment, certainly the favorite to be reelected. And two is that the Republican Congress, which came in with such enthusiasm and so much energy behind it, is finding itself not quite clear on what direction is the wisest direction to take going into an election. And I think that that they are now, instead of being the people with the voice, they're looking for their voice. They're likely to find it between now and the election. And that could work one of two ways. It could work for them or against them. And my guess is that they will be firm enough and secure enough in their incumbencies now that the Republican Congress will be reelected, and that will have the effect of electing Bill Clinton, because Americans don't like government very much, and we like to have checks and balances.
And that is the ultimate checks and balances, isn't it?
That he will essentially run as stop Newt with me.
Now, how about what's your take on the current Supreme Court?
Well, the current Supreme Court is fascinating because it is so divided. I mean, we get so many 5-4 decisions that the person who is the next president will certainly be in a position of making the court either more secure in its fives or tilt it the other way. But it's interesting, President Clinton has not felt free to appoint liberals to the Supreme Court. He has not had the kind of Senate where he would be able to do that, and I think that's probably worked for him. Judge Breyer was a pick of Orrin Hatch, the senator from Utah, and became Bill Clinton's pick, sort of hesitant and not very supportive, but is on the Supreme Court.
You're married to a distinguished journalist in his own right, Stephen Roberts, senior writer, U.S. News and World Report, and you all write a column, a weekly column, and syndicated in many papers. What's it like in that very opinionated household? I mean, there's got to be some hellacious arguments.
There are, but actually we agree much more than we disagree. We haven't yet written a column where we internally disagree in the column. We're working our way up to that. And the way we work the column now is that one writes it one week and the other one edits it. We talk about it ahead of time, and then one person will sit down and write it, and the other one will edit it. But we are working our way into something where we actually tell the public where we disagree. The place where we've had the biggest fights over the last year or so has been on the question of Bosnia, where I was for intervention and Steve was not.
What do you think now that we intervened?
Well, of course, we intervened in a very different way. We intervened as part of a peace process as opposed to going into a hot war. And I think that it was by far the right thing to do. A little late, a few 100,000 people dead and millions of refugees.
On a more gentle subject, do you miss Louisiana cooking?
Of course, but I cook Louisiana cooking.
You do? What all do you like to cook?
Well, I'm a good cook, and I cook, you know, to me, food was red beans and rice and okra stew and stuffed red fish. I remember, you know, when we were kids, Friday nights, of course, you couldn't eat meat, and our Friday night dinners were things like stuffed red fish. Of course, I hated it and wanted plain spaghetti with butter, but that was food, and shrimp Creole, all that. So that's what I cook and do it all the time.
Do you get back to Louisiana very often?
I get back a few times a year. I come more for funerals than I would like to, but I get back as often as I can because I miss seeing the crepe myrtle early and the camellias so early and being with Mama in that feisty spot on Bourbon Street and all of that.
Can you imagine? An apartment on Bourbon Street.
A house, not an apartment.
Excuse me. Yeah, we sat in that beautiful courtyard when I interviewed her, and it's a dream world. You kind of have to pinch yourself to come back to reality.
Well, and then you walk out the door, and boy, is that reality.
Now, your brother, whom I hope we can interview soon if this program goes to Washington to do a series of interviews, your brother is probably the lobbyist in Washington, the insider, the lobbyist, the manipulator, mover, shaker, a gentleman of tremendous influence. Do you and he have a good political relationship? Do you sometimes feel anti his clients, that kind of thing?
I don't even know who his clients are, Gus, so it's not an issue. I mean, when we talk politics, we talk the kind of politics you and I are talking now. We don't talk about who he's representing.
Tell me about your sister whom you lost.
Well, where do you want me to begin?
Died of cancer. Was a mayor, wasn't she?
Barbara was a very special person. She was a mayor. She was a public servant, very much in the tradition of my parents. And she was also one of the funniest people you've ever met and one of the smartest and a fabulous writer and has a book of poems that she has written that is published. And we miss her incredibly. I mean, there's always a hole in our lives.
So your family, who've enjoyed all of the glory, you're one of the great American families, there's no doubt about it. You've also, your mother, I think, y'all lost a little boy. Mm-hmm. So y'all have also known great tragedy.
But we've been very blessed. We've had many wonderful blessings. We have, among us, we have 8 fabulous kids, and Tommy has 4 wonderful grandchildren so far, the lucky duck, and if our kids don't catch up soon, we're going to really be mad.
Is that religious faith that's always been so strong with your mother, is that still very strong in this generation of the Boggs family?
Oh, certainly. I don't think there's any question about that. And our children are people of wonderful principle. They are people you can count on to do the right thing for the right people.
Cokie, do you feel good about these United States in this year, 1996? Do you feel that we're good people and that we're doing good things?
I am, but you know, I am really a Pollyanna about this, Gus. I do think that this experiment in the United States of America is still the greatest government experiment of all time. And look, the fact that we're having an argument about immigration, just think about it. The reason we're having the argument is because people want to come here. Right. It's still the great ideal where people want to come because they know this is the place where if they have it, they can make it. That there's nobody that's going to say you weren't born to the right people, or you don't have the right godfather, or your name has the wrong vowel on the end of it, or whatever. This is the place where if you are willing to do the work, you can make it. That doesn't mean that we don't have discrimination and laws that we need to enforce and attitudes that we need to improve. I'm not saying everything's perfect, but it's still the best place on earth.
A quick question. Is liberalism in the style of Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon Johnson and Hale Boggs, is that dead?
The idea of liberalism as big government programs is dead because there's no money, and a lot of people question whether those programs have been as effective as they were hoped to be when they were created. But the idea of helping each other and of of open expression and of inclusion is not dead, and I'm happy to say it's not dead in either political party.
Cokie Roberts, thank you so much for coming home and joining us on Louisiana Legends. In the 15 years that I've done this program, you and Lindy are the first mother-daughter combination, and it was just a pleasure and an honor to have you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Now it's time for me to go have an oyster poor boy.
Louisiana Legends is made possible by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Louisiana. This important program series enables us to discover, through the accomplishments of our fellow Louisianians, the unique character of a state so proudly served by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Louisiana for 60 years.